December 20th, 1943. The skies over northern Germany were cold, gray, and thick with flak bursts. A young American pilot, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, just 21 years old, was at the controls of a B-17 Flying Fortress on his first combat mission as aircraft commander. Plane, tail number 423167, nicknamed the Olde Pub, belonged to the 379th Bomb Group. Part of the 8th Air Force based in England, Brown had trained rigorously, but nothing prepared him for the reality of a daylight precision bombing raid deep into enemy territory. His crew of 9 other men, all in their early 20s, included a navigator, bombardier, radio operator, gunners, and engineers, ordinary Americans from farms and cities, thrown into the war's deadliest aerial campaign. On the other side was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a 22-year-old Luftwaffe fighter pilot with Jaguar J Schwader 27, a unit hardened by years of combat. Stigler had already claimed 22 victories, including 2 B-17s earlier that day, putting him 1 kill away from the coveted Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for pilots. He had flown in North Africa and Sicily, where he learned from mentors like Gustav Radal the unwritten code of aerial chivalry rules that emphasized honor even in war. The mission that day for the Americans was to bomb an FW-190 fighter aircraft factory in Bremen, a heavily defended industrial hub. Over 500 BS-17s and B-24s launched from England, escorted BP-47 Thunderbolt fighters, but the P-47s had limited range and turned back early, leaving the bombers vulnerable for the final push. The formation approached Bremen at 27,300 feet, where temperatures plunged to -60°C. Oxygen masks froze to faces, and the air was thin enough to cause blackouts without them. As they neared the target, the flak started hundreds of 88mm anti-aircraft guns firing in barrages, black puffs exploding around the planes like deadly fireworks. Shrapnel tore through metal and plexiglass. The Olde Pub took direct hits almost immediately. The number 2 engine caught fire and had to be feathered, its propeller windmilling uselessly. Hydraulic lines burst, freezing the controls stiff. The bombardier released their payload over the factory, but the damage was mounting. The plane shuddered from impacts, and Brown fought to keep it in formation as the group banked away for home. More flak followed them out. The nose section shattered, sending shards into the navigator and bombardier, wounding both. Oxygen systems failed in parts of the plane, forcing crew to scramble for portable bottles. The vertical stabilizer on the tail was riddled, nearly severed. Braun dropped out of the protective box formation, becoming a straggler and easy target for the waiting Luftwaffe fighters. The cold seeped in through holes, and blood from wounds froze on the floor plates. The crew knew they were now alone, 250 miles from safety, with the North Sea between them and England. Meanwhile, the crippled B-17 drifted lower, engines straining, the crew clinging to whatever oxygen remained. Brown kept the nose pointed northwest, toward the North Sea, knowing every mile gained was a miracle. The plane was bleeding altitude, down to perhaps 12,000 feet now. And the cold was merciless. Frost formed on the inside of the shattered windows. The wounded men in the nose and waist were barely conscious, their blood freezing on their flight suits. Franz Stigler had just landed at Oldenburg Airfield after claiming his 2nd kill of the day. His Messerschmitt BFA 109 was being refueled when he heard the low, ragged drone of a heavy bomber passing almost directly overhead. He looked up and saw it a flying fortress, so torn apart it seemed impossible it was still flying. The tail was mangled, the rudder cables likely cut, the fuselage perforated with dozens of large holes. No tracers came from the waist or tail positions. The bomber was defenseless. Stigler climbed back into his fighter, took off, and climbed quickly to intercept. He approached from 6 o'clock high, standard fighter attack position. As he closed, he could see the extent of the damage in the weak winter light. Blood streaking the windows. Crew members slumped or moving weakly inside, one engine feathered and trailing smoke. He lined up his gun sight on the bomber's fuselage. His finger rested on the trigger. He had every right orders, survival instinct, the Knight's Cross within reach. But he didn't fire. Stigler later said he felt something shift inside him. Shooting men who could no longer fight back felt like executing prisoners. He remembered the words of his old instructor, Gustav Radal. Fight honorably, even against the enemy. In Africa and Sicily, Stigler had seen enough death. He knew the difference between combat and slaughter. He also knew the risk if he let this bomber escape and word got back. He could face a firing squad for treason. He eased his Messerschmitt closer, wingtip to wingtip. With the B-17, Brown, fighting the controls, noticed the German fighter sliding into position beside him. The crew, who could still see, up braced for the end. Some tried to swing their guns around, but the weapons were jammed or the men too weak to aim, no shots coming. Instead, the German pilot rocked his wings gently, a universal signal in the air. Lower your landing gear. Land here. Become prisoners and live. Brown understood the gesture, but shook his head. He would not surrender his crew to captivity if there was any chance of reaching England. Stigler tried again, pointing downward toward a German airfield visible below. Brown refused once more. The German pilot then made his choice. He pulled ahead slightly, took up a protective position in front and to the right of the bomber, and began leading it toward the coast. Any flak batteries or patrolling fighters that appeared, Stigler waggled his wings sharply to warn them off. He stayed close enough that Brown could follow his silhouette against the clouds. For nearly 20 minutes, the two aircraft flew in eerie silence. No radio contact was possible. Brown's set was dead, and even if it weren't, neither man would have broken the quiet. The BC-17's remaining engines droned steadily. The Messerschmitts, Daimler-Benz, purred beside it. Crew members in the waist waved weakly through the holes, a gesture of disbelief and gratitude. Stigler could see their face, young, exhausted, some bleeding. Brown kept glancing sideways at the German fighter, unsure if this was a trick or real mercy. As they neared the Dutch coast, Stigler raised his hand to his forehead in a crisp salute. Then he rolled his Messerschmitt to the left, dove away, and disappeared into the overcast. Brown watched him go until the fighter vanished. The B-17 was now alone again, but out of German airspace. The North Sea crossing was the hardest part. Storms rolled in, visibility dropped to near zero, and the damaged bomber bucked in turbulence. Brown trimmed what controls he could, using sheer muscle to keep the wings level. The crew rationed to the last of the oxygen, passing bottles hand to hand. No one spoke much. Words froze in their throats. Brown knew they were losing fuel slowly from punctured lines, and the altimeter kept unwinding. He flew on instruments when he could see nothing outside, trusting the compass and the faint outline of waves below when the clouds parted. After what felt like hours but was closer to 40 minutes, the English coast appeared through breaks in the weather. RAF Spitfires soon appeared, circling the battered fortress warily before recognizing it as friendly. They escorted it inland. Brown lined up for the nearest airfield, seething lowering, flaps, and gear with what little hydraulics remained. The landing was rough. The plane bounced once, then settled hard, skidding off the runway into the grass. It stopped in a cloud of dirt and smoke. Ground crews rushed out. Of the 10 men aboard, only Brown and 2 others were able to climb out on their own. The rest were carried to ambulances, some unconscious, others barely breathing. One gunner would die later from his wounds, but 8 survived. The ground crews at RFC Thing pulled the crew from the wreckage. Medics worked fast. Brown was helped down the ladder, his shoulder wound bandaged, frostbite on his hands and face. The bombardier and navigator were stretchered out, unconscious from blood loss and hypoxia. The waist gunners and engineer were in worse shape, some barely responsive. One of the gunners, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, had been killed instantly by a cannon shell early in the fight. His body was recovered later. The plane itself was a total write-off too, damage to repair. Brown filed his debrief report that night, still dazed from the ordeal. He described the German fighter that appeared, flew alongside, never fired, and then saluted before vanishing. The intelligence officers listened, exchanged glances, and classified the entire account as secret. They told Brown not to speak of it again. The reasoning was simple. If word spread that German pilots sometimes showed mercy, it might encourage enemy airmen to hesitate in future engagements, or worse, give the Luftwaffe propaganda material. So the story stayed buried. No medals were awarded at the time. The crew recovered in hospitals. Some returned to flying, others were grounded for good. Brown himself went on to fly more missions before the war ended. Franz Stigler never mentioned the incident to anyone during the war. He knew what the Gestapo or SS might do if they learned he had deliberately spared an enemy bomber. He finished the war with 28 confirmed victories, survived being shot down multiple times, and surrendered to American forces in May 1945. After the war, like many former Luftwaffe pilots, he faced a difficult transition. In 1957, he emigrated to Canada, where he built a successful business in Vancouver, married, raised a family, and quietly lived out his life without seeking recognition for that December day.